Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm Thomas V. Miras. This podcast is an offering to the Holy Family and, less importantly, a production of CatholicCulture.org. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I apologize for any noise that you might be hearing in the background right now. There's some construction going on outside my apartment as I record this little intro. Today, in lieu of a new episode, I've got another highlights piece for you with some great clips from episodes far in the past. Before I tell you about those clips, though, let me quickly let you know what'll be coming up after this. Next week, I will have an awesome interview for you with Joshua Wren, who is a fiction writer, the editor of Wise Blood Books, and the co-founder of a new Catholic Master of Fine Arts literature program at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. We talked about his new book, How to Read and Write Like a Catholic, which is really good. Then September is going to be kind of interesting because it's almost going to be a month of outreach. I am doing a crossover episode, which will be published in this feed, with the online Great Books podcast, where we'll be discussing Jacques Maritain's essay, Art and Scholasticism. And then I'll be a guest on The Meaning of Catholic with Tim Flanders, discussing Pope St. John Paul II's letter to artists. That will not be published here, but I will link you to it when it comes out. So today I'm going to give you some highlights from episodes 38 through 41 and 44. So you'll be hearing me talk with Matthew Meinard about the great Dominican theologian Garrigou-Lagrange. You'll be hearing me talk to sacred music composer Paul Jernberg about the appropriateness or lack thereof of gospel music in the Catholic liturgy. You will be hearing me speak with Jonathan Mcintosh from our episode on Tolkien and Aquinas. The clips you'll hear are about Tolkien's metaphysics more generally. And let's see, what else? You've got a bit with the African anti-abortion activist Obianuju Ekeocha about the ways that the West tries to force illegal abortions into places like Kenya. And finally, you'll hear a bit of my interview with the great American Catholic poet and former head of the National Endowment for the Arts, Dana Gioia. So again, I'm sorry I don't have a new episode for you this week, but you know what? God is in control. Just trying to submit myself to his permissive will here, and we'll get you some new stuff soon enough. So again, first you'll be hearing a couple clips from episode 38, Garrigou-Lagrange, the Sacred Monster of Thomism, translator Matthew Meinard, who has translated a few more books by Garrigou, I believe, since we had this conversation. This was kind of the first in a series, if I'm not mistaken. You'll be hearing him talk a little bit about some general themes in Garrigou's theology, and in particular, the importance of maintaining a proper distinction between the natural and the supernatural. This is one of my favorite episodes of the podcast. I highly recommend going and listening to the whole thing. Of course, I'll be linking to all of the full episodes in the show notes and description for this. It's also the most challenging book that I've had to read for the podcast. I felt like I leveled up a few times and had a number of ways of thinking and assumptions I was making about theology opened up for me. So I definitely benefited intellectually from reading the book, and talking to Matthew was a great help in understanding what I had read. He's a great guy. You can hear a lot more of him on the Reason and Theology podcast, where he is a recurring guest, by the way. So let's get into the book, titled The Sense of Mystery, Clarity and Obscurity in the Intellectual Life. Now, this is a very broad topic. Obviously, it covers a lot of different themes from Garrigou's theology in light of this idea of the sense of mystery. And he starts out by talking about, well, maybe he doesn't start with this, but pretty early on, he talks about the different types of clarity and the different types of obscurity. So can you talk about that a little bit? What is he talking about when he says clarity and obscurity?
But yeah, right. the title in French is actually that it's the intellectual chiaroscuro, that it's, that the idea that our knowledge, of some of the most basic realities that we know are these mixtures of very certain things and very obscure aspects as well. And so he considers, sort of the whole swath of both the kind of that which is lowest, matter, prime matter for the Thomists in the room, but materiality itself is a great mystery. The Thomists hold that, matter and form are principles of everything, but matter's undefined, but it's a real kind of potency. And it's an incredibly difficult thing to actually express. But kind of at the heights, the knowledge we have of God is a knowledge that's, it's so blinding for us here below. I mean, that we're like, like the famous line from Aristotle, like bats that flit about in light that's too bright for our eyes. And yet there are things that we can know with rock solid certainty about God. We can know the divine names, the divine attributes, right? Even the philosopher can know this, that God is the highest goodness, God is the highest beauty, God is he who is eminently one, God is self-subsistent existence. And yet somehow in God, these are all eminently one thing in the Godhead. And so there's, right there, and just, sort of these sort of simple looking proofs of God's existence, the divine names, you have this blinding combination of utter certainty for the metaphysician, but also, too, an incredible awareness of the weakness of our concepts. And so throughout the text, he considers, a number of themes related to this. Some of it seems odd. He talks about sensation. Actually, the phenomena of sensation is something that's actually quite obscure. What separates the plant from the animal is something he even holds that really we can't completely articulate in this lifetime. And that's striking whenever you think that he's supposedly this manualist who kind of is superficial as a thinker and doesn't have an awareness, according to certain narratives, of these profound mysteries and our inability to know things.
One of the ideas that struck me early on was this idea that there is obscurity from on high and obscurity from below. So there's obscurity. He talks about the proper object of the human intellect being sensible being, right? Or intelligible being, I should say, intelligible being insofar as it's perceived, abstracted from sensible things. So pure being as such, just grasped directly, whether our own or angels or of God, is above our intellect. So those things are obscurity from on high. And yet there is an obscurity from below, and that would maybe take a little more explaining, but I'd be interested to hear your explanation of what he says about that.
Yeah, and so you very well kind of reformulated my last answer to put it directly in his terms. So mostly what I was talking about actually was the obscurity from on high, which of course we could dwell on, but obscurity from below, one of the examples that he gives in the text, and I believe I get lost in these books, but I believe it's even the epigram for the text, is about the mystery of evil. Evil is a kind of non-being, right? This is the Augustinian insight, and it's very strongly in Aquinas' account of evil. And I mean, non-being is a very difficult thing to talk about because we only know it indirectly, so to speak. We formulate the idea of non-consideration of the rule of reason. That's how the Thomists speak of what causes evil. But we're talking about a nothingness like it's a something. So this is, a universal phenomenon that we experience that's, really unable to be grasped at directly. Or once again, this idea of potency and matter. Too often people read, well, not that many people, but people who've gone to Christendom college, I think like you did, or Thomas Aquinas College, or maybe Catholic U, read the physics of Aristotle, and they think they have this little story about the four causes pretty easily down, and matter and potency, or act and potency, and matter and form. But matter, potency, these are things that are actually not defined. So Aristotle teaches an intrinsic principle of all things is its determining element, form, and whatever receives that determination, matter. But that means matter is undetermined. And the undetermined is something that can't be defined. And yet we truck in these things even whenever we're not being philosophers all the time. I assure your listeners who are not sort of the experts in these things, or who are not, philosophers by training, that all the time whenever we talk about things, matter and form are involved. And there's an element of that that's actually not clear, precisely because it's undefined. So that's what he's reflecting on there. I mean, the issue is with Father Garrigou, very deceptively simple, and yet he's also dealing with these issues of, Aristotelian philosophy that are, shall we say, not table conversation, at least normal tables.
Right. So it's interesting. So you were talking about how matter as such is mysterious. But there's also this idea of matter being mysterious in terms of individuality, because matter is the principle of individuality, meaning what distinguishes two things with the same form from one another is their matter that they take part in. So I don't know how to quite approach it, but there's this idea that individuality itself, we tend to think as moderns, individuality is what makes us special, and there's something to that, but it's not quite so simple that individuality is itself just a sort of unmitigated highest good. It actually derives from a sort of a lack of being, which makes it obscure. Am I getting somewhere correct there?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's actually personality that we should be most concerned with, right, as moderns, as being the thing that defines us. But yeah, for, two separate trees, if you try to define actually what it is that makes them exist as separate, I mean, at least on an Aristotelian model of matter and form, what you actually are saying is, well, they have the same basic life structure, the same form. But what makes them distinct is the undetermined reception of that form. And that very fact is, it's like saying there's something almost indefinable that makes them individually what they are. And this is why actually you have that maxim from St. Thomas, probably cited by Garrigou in the book, actually, that the individual is ineffable because the individual can't be defined.
Right.
So,
well, that's, yeah, I mean, he also talks about it's because there's a difference between the human being has an intelligible form. It's not, I'm probably not getting this right, but the human being has a form that is intelligible, sort of. Gosh, I'm having trouble with this, but
yeah, I think I know exactly what you're getting at. Is he holds that the only thing that we can have in our experience an actual definition of, like a real definition of, is the human person. He basically thinks that all of our knowledge in the sciences, his idea is more, it's not a positivism, but it's closer to a kind of positivism, that we can at best know accidents and proper accidents of things, but that we actually only have a real definition of the human person precisely because of our own intelligible structure as spiritual beings.
Right.
I mean, it's a fascinating point because once again, you have a sense, then he's saying, we don't have essential definitions of anything other than that, at least in our physical knowledge. I mean, there's part of me that wants to say there are many qualifications we should make to this. But in any case, he's well aware of the fact that neat and tight definitions are actually a quite difficult affair. And this is something right out of St. Thomas as well.
Yeah, and this, as an artist, this also made me sort of think hard because we talk about the mystery in beauty, in sensible beauty, or what is behind sensible beauty. And this would seem to imply that part of the mystery of the beauty of material things is also due to the sort of obscurity due to inferiority to the proper object of the human intellect, but it is also mysterious in terms of its participation in God. So it's like there's a mystery due to its less full participation and also due to that participation which it does have.
Yeah, I think, I mean, of course, the Thomist will always want to say it's primarily because of that transcendental characteristic of beauty, which is going to be kind of the from on high mystery that beauty gets its character. But each little beauty, each little work of Bach is this unique reflection of the incommunicable beauty of God. And so, I mean, individual experiences of beauty do have like a kind of uniqueness that's only possible precisely because they're finite. And so, finitude itself, does contain, it contains and refracts the beauty. And so the refracting, which would be something like the mystery from below, also is a source of the manifold character of beauty. It's somewhat like the Platonic theme of the receptacle. The Platonists love the idea of the images capturing the ideas. It's a kind of non-being that is. So that's the mystery. That's the mystery of individual things or particular beauties. Yeah.
Yes, and you could say the same thing about human beings. I mean, personality being the most important thing. That aside, you could say, well, the individuality is due to participation in matter, which is or sort of a lesser participation in being, but it also has value precisely because it is different. Each one is different from the other, and each one reflects something of God each person reflects something of God, even just as an individual, that the other does not. So it's not that we could sort of put everybody together and then get a picture of God from that, but it is refracted, as you say.
Yeah, there's nothing more beautiful than someone who lifts their finite conditions in a moral, and we would say as Catholics, a divine way through the life of grace. Like you make the conditions of your life, which come from individuality, shine with the beauty of moral goodness, artistic goodness, the divine goodness of grace. And the supreme case of this, and the most beautiful case of individuality, which is supremely distinct from personality, is the case of Christ. Because Christ has and this is straight from Father Garrigou-Lagrange, Christ has an uncreated personality, the personality of the Word, and yet his human nature is individuated. And so you have a case there in his human nature, of a kind of refraction in his human nature of the uncreated beauty. I mean, this is the whole theme of theandric acts, for instance. One cannot begin to contemplate the way that those human acts, as particular and instantiated moments in salvation history, uniquely reflected in the most bright light beauty. And we don't just contemplate, when we contemplate the hypostatic union, just the Word as the second person, immanent in the Trinity. We contemplate that great mystery that the individuality of the human nature of Christ bore the weight of such a great beauty from on high in this particular way. Anyway, so just a thought that came to my mind.
No, that's really great. And it just seems as though the entirety of his philosophy, as I've encountered in this book, is all about preserving the distinction between the natural and the supernatural so that God can be God. He talks very early about the importance of God not being accessible to the senses, because if he were accessible to the senses, then he would not be God. He would be something proportioned to the senses, not the completely superior being that he is. And then it's important that his intimate life is not accessible to reason, because then either he would be something that is on the level of reason, of natural things, or we would be supernatural in some sense, being able to access the supernatural with our reasons, and our intellects would be proportioned to the divine being, and then we would have pantheism. So, there's all sorts of different important things you can take away from his discussion. But yeah, I don't know where else we can go. Of course, we could go in any number of directions, but it's just fascinating to really sit down and reflect on how distant we are from God. It's easy to say that, but all of these small, important distinctions that Garrigou-Lagrange makes really point to this hugely important distinction.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons for people looking askance at him, because he fell out with, he and Henri de Lubac don't agree on exactly how to parse this distinction between what's natural and what's supernatural. But it is like a golden thread running through Garrigou's mind that if you don't make this distinction, the things that you say could follow from it. That you won't understand the grandeur of what the Christian is called to, and to the life that we begin living here below, if you don't see that it's an essentially supernatural life. It's very important in his mind. And what's interesting, he has these chapters. I don't know if you remember reading that first chapter of the second section of the text, where he talks about, can reason prove if there's an essentially supernatural order of truths?
Yes.
It's a very technical chapter, I would think, correct?
Yeah, for sure.
But you're well educated, so I'm not trying to scare the listeners away. But at first, it seems like this sort of odd question to ask. But he's very concerned with showing, like, almost as high as reason can go. And he even says, since we're aware that God can know himself in the highest way, we can say by reason that there's a supernatural order of truths that we can't know. Like, that is like this golden highest point that reason can go, and then is mute.
Yeah, as to the content of that supernatural order.
Yeah, but it's very important to just sort of take time and stay there. So, just sort of meditatingly stay present to that fact, that you're able to know that point. And this is what the Thomists refer to then as, you can even have a non-efficacious desire for that. You can have a desire that would say, I can know of that, and it would be so wonderful if I could know that mystery if indeed it were possible, and yet it's not, for I see not how it could be. And this is precisely why there's no demand that nature can make to be fulfilled by the supernatural order by Father Garrigou-Lagrange. This is why the second chapter then moves on to this question. We can't actually demonstrate that the direct vision of God is something we know by reason alone. And it sounds so technical, but it's the life of our life. Because when that answer comes, whenever by revelation we find out we are actually called to that immense and eternal life that is unchanging in the contemplation of God in the hereafter, we actually find out that our highest hope is fulfilled, that we never could have dared to hope for.
As with so many things reading this book, I found myself being forced to separate concepts that I had sort of lumped together. Now, of course, I knew that, having a relationship with God as Father is different from just as the creature to the Creator. But, when we think about desire for going to heaven, we kind of lump together all these things, the desire to be loving God and serving God perfectly, the desire to be at perfect peace with God as our Creator, the idea of existing in an order of perfect happiness and justice, the desire to be loved by God in some sense, to be with God in some sense. But the beatific vision, what it is in itself, is more than just sort of being with God as the creature is to the Creator or something like that. Even if that were able to be done perfectly on its own order, the beatific vision is truly something that I cannot really conceptualize or imagine what it's like. So it made me realize that I've hardly, even as a Catholic for 29 years, I've hardly begun to desire the beatific vision as it is in itself.
Yeah, because the only concept that expresses it is the vision itself.
Yeah.
That's it, right? And yet, what is it? It's, it is all these things that you say. I mean, people have very good and correct desires for heaven, but above all, it's the intentional union in the same life, in knowledge and love, that is the divine life. It's not a pantheistic confusion, but we will live through knowledge and love, the very life of God in an unmediated fashion. The concept, if we can use that word, the concept that we will know is actually God directly. This is making the beatific vision sound like something static. We'll share the life and love of God. Directly. It's immense. And that's our life here below. That's what faith starts here below. Grace starts here below.
Right. Yeah, participating in it already, but not seeing it. And certainly not necessarily experiencing it in a psychological way. Not that it is something that can be experienced in a psychological way. And that's another thing that he says, that, by our intellect or our psychological experience cannot tell us whether we're experiencing something supernatural, whether it's the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, whether a certain act is motivated by supernatural charity or some human motive. It's not that we can't have a good sense of these things from sort of external indicators, but they cannot be demonstrated. We cannot know for certain with our intellect or based on our experience in the sort of subjective psychological sense.
Yeah, which is, I just think, a great example of, this immense sense of mystery that he has, that even in the living out of our life of faith, that this is the case. This is also why at the end of the book he talks about the nights of the senses and the nights of the spirit.
Sure.
Because you must be purified for that. Yeah.
Yeah. I will say, just as an aside, I haven't read de Lubac's work on natural and supernatural, but I do, based on reading Garrigou's argument, I do tend to agree with him that, whatever you can say about the heights to which man's natural desires can reach, as with his knowledge, if man were to naturally desire in an absolute sense the beatific vision as such, that would mean that man's nature is proportioned to the supernatural, in which case there would be no need for grace to elevate us to that level. So it makes sense to me that not only the reality and the achievement, but the actual desire itself would need to be brought on by grace.
Yeah, and that's at least what the Thomists, who get worked up at de Lubac, think they see. And it's not completely clear. That's clearly the bent. He doesn't hold, of course, that nature demands grace. De Lubac doesn't hold that.
Of course.
But, someone like a Garrigou says we've got to be crystal clear in making our distinctions here. It's very important. But the Thomists say distinguish in order to unite. If I remember correctly, de Lubac said he loved to say, but you should first unite things in order to be able to distinguish them. As you know, so to a Thomist, it's just two different ways of going about things. So it just gives the jitters to the Thomist.
Right. So there was a big question that I've had for a while that this book basically answered for me. And that is, what is it about the theological virtue of faith that makes it supernatural? In other words, I tend to think of sort of the external things that make faith credible, for example, the longevity and the consistency of the Catholic Church, things like that, as sort of the reason that faith seems credible to me. Not of course the reason that I think I know the things that faith teaches through reason, but I also know that people have the capability of simply arbitrarily deciding to believe things without knowing them and without having supernatural faith. And also that, through miracles and things like that, people can come to conclude that the truth of something can't be denied. So what is it exactly that makes faith supernatural? And what he says is something quite profound, which is that the formal cause of faith is not the external authority of the church. The formal cause is the voice of the Father speaking intimately in my soul, and that is what is actually causing me to believe these things. And that makes faith a far more, aside from charity, even faith itself is a sort of intimate participation in the life of God, which is something that I hadn't really considered before.
Yeah, this is a very, very, very important thing in his book, De Revelatione. I mean, the whole book is actually on this topic, 1,200, 1,400 pages worth. That it's very important to have what's called a judgment of credibility, that it's rationally believable, both for kind of miraculous reasons, as well as the fact that revelation fulfills our deepest desires to believe. That reason should be able to say, that is something I should believe. And yet there's an infinite separation between saying that's really and truly believable and belief. Because the act of faith, like you said, I mean, it's such a wonderful line, right? That it's the voice of the Father speaking in us, that we believe, as the Thomists say, or St. Thomas says too at the Treatise of Faith on Faith at the beginning, that we believe precisely because God reveals. And of course, that sounds like a kind of slavishness. Well, because God says that I do it, or I believe it. But no, it's because I've seen now the truth of this. There's a beautiful passage from Henri Dominique Lacordaire that he cites somewhere else. He was a great French Dominican preacher in the 19th century, where he talks about, there's the man who, he's walked about and he's seeing the beauty and truth of the faith. And he sees the stunning story of the martyrs, and you could even say the coherence of Catholic doctrine, etc. But he can't make the transition. He can't make the step. And then one day, and Lacordaire says something like, was it on a street corner? Was it by my fireside? I don't know. But I saw and believed. And from that day, I had faith. And I mean, there's something ineffable in faith precisely because it is this new life. There's beautiful stuff in that encyclical by Benedict XVI, Spe Salvi, where he talks about faith really taking this, it's a theme from the Epistle to Hebrews. It's the substance of things hoped for. I mean, it is the bedrock beginning. I mean, it's not, we're not saved through faith alone. Charity alone is the thing that we must have, right? But we can only have charity if we first supernaturally know the Father. So charity is the full budding forth of this obscure knowledge that we have of the Father, of the Trinity, of the mysteries, supernaturally. And so faith there's a certain interpersonal element to faith. We think of it as like knowledge, but I mean, it's this profound relationship that we have that's a knowledge, but it's a relationship with God who reveals.
Next up, episode 39, Composing Liturgical Music That's Noble, Accessible, and Sacred. This is a little bit of a tangent we went on from the interview, which I really enjoyed. So, Paul Jernberg is a Catholic sacred composer, but I learned in the interview that he had a background from before he was Catholic in gospel music. So, I was curious. We talk about enculturation in the Mass and things like that. So, I was curious what he thought about the appropriateness of gospel music in the Catholic liturgy. And here were some of his off the cuff thoughts on that. Well, I would like to hear about the gospel aspect because this is something I've wondered about occasionally. I haven't found an example of it where I felt it really worked.
Right. Yeah.
But at least in terms of style, maybe some of the actual hymns themselves could be done in a Catholic appropriate style. But I would love to hear whatever thoughts you have on that.
Sure. Yeah, I think that we need to see first the gospel music for what it is and for the setting for which it's intended, which is primarily a Protestant setting in which they will say the 3 P's, which are prayer, praise, and preaching. So, and the praise being the music, and the prayer and so for the preaching is obvious. But it grew up in a whole system that is lacking the sacramental dimension, but which lacking that dimension, I think, developed in its own inspired way, and in a way that has a power to reach people in certain circumstances in an amazing way. It's also can be very cathartic. So, the question is then, to what extent can this phenomenon, which I think is a beautiful one, when it's done well, to what extent can this be adapted to the Catholic liturgy? And I don't have all the answers to that question yet, but I've been working on it for a long time. And I think that what I can say is this. It's very important that we realize that in an ideal situation, our culture, yes, it has the liturgy at its heart, but there need to be all sorts of other venues that are not necessarily liturgical. So I think in a healthy culture, you see both the sacred and the profane not being in terms of curse words, but the profane being outside of the temple. Both these aspects are very important.
There's room for religious music that is not liturgical music as well, of course.
Exactly. And that's how I have learned to understand this. And I would say, if I can put it this way, that I think gospel music is one of those kinds of music that can be really wonderful religious music in its proper context. But when we get to the liturgy, we're talking about something happening that has very specific requirements. And now, a pastor in a given situation needs to make prudential judgments. And it's not my job to judge what this pastor or that pastor does. And I realize there are parishes where gospel music is used on a regular basis. And I know people who have gone to these and have been very excited and inspired by them. The challenge, though, is this, that I would say that the liturgy, the Mass, by its nature, needs to have a strong contemplative dimension in which we are drawn into this, what I'd say, the threefold aspect of this contemplative dimension, which are, first of all, the adoration of God, the worship of God with profound reverence. Number 2, to be open to be transformed by the grace of God. And number 3, intimate communion with God in Christ. So really, what we're talking about in the liturgy is something that is different than many of the other activities which we legitimately enjoy. Here's the analogy, which in one way I hesitate to use, but because it is such a strong one, but I think it's valid. In other words, a married couple will have all sorts of things that they enjoy doing together, but that is different and that which are really good for them to do together. But there's a difference between that and their intimacy as a couple. And I see that as an analogy with the sacred liturgy, especially with the Mass. The Mass is meant to be this time of profound intimacy with Christ. And for that, just like the married couple would not take everything into their intimacy, there's all sorts of good things that should not be part of that. Similarly, the liturgy has certain things as far as its music that are needed for that music to be appropriate.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Very interesting comparison. It's interesting, I was thinking, I don't know if this is true or not. I was thinking gospel music is more overtly sentimental than the Catholic sacred music tradition, but I wonder that might not be true. Maybe it's more overtly personally sentimental. I'm not sure how to describe it. Does that seem anywhere near the truth?
We need to define sentimental, and different people define it different ways, but I think...
Sure.
I see that a lot of the contemporary standard liturgical music in the Roman Rite is very sentimental. I mean, a lot of times if we define sentimental as engaging primarily the emotions in a strong way, then I would say that a lot of the songs that we use in Mass in typical parishes is very sentimental. And it really tends to engage emotions. Gospel music, it's a little different, I would say. I think it's, if I can say it this way, it's more visceral. It really tends to stimulate the whole body, not only the emotions, but it tends to evoke a very physical response that sometimes can be sort of wild, actually. Anyone who's experienced this in an actual parish situation or a Black Baptist church, for example, will know that this sometimes can become very, extremely stimulating physically, in the sense of people who are 80 years old getting up and running around the church, or people screaming, from the top of their lungs with a sense of being, hit by the Spirit, to people, doing very lively movements and motion. And so there's a physical element that is very strong, and which is part of if I can put it this way, it in a certain sense, that's part of the genius of gospel when it's in balance, because it does have this sense of engaging us body and soul. But in certain circumstances, it can go pretty wild. So I think of it more in terms of those terms, in terms of more cathartic and physically as well as emotionally engaging, rather than purely sentimental.
Either way, it's not exerting a calming physiological effect typically.
No, although I have to say that sometimes with this cathartic effect, of just, you sort of get out everything that's inside of you and you just shout it out, and and there is an aspect of that afterwards can lead to a great peace. And I've witnessed this in myself and in others, and in working with this gospel choir. It's not like, it was very remarkable to me to see how after we had a concert at the Lund Cathedral. Lund, I guess we say in English, but the great cathedral. It's one of the ancient cathedrals in Sweden. And the choir that I brought, they sang one of their final concerts there. And I was doing the translating, and I was a little embarrassed because at a certain point, towards the end, they started dancing. in I guess they might say dancing in the Spirit. I don't know. And there were shouts, and there were, here we are with the church filled with very introverted Swedish people. And I became I became a little uncomfortable, to say the least. But it was so interesting because after this concert, I was with the choir. And the choir was remarkably peaceful and radiant. And the people who came, the newspapers were filled the next day with these just radiant reports of how much people had been moved by this thing. So yeah, it be wild, but I wouldn't. I think there's something in the cathartic aspect and the that is we shouldn't downplay completely.
Episode 40 was Tolkien and Aquinas with Jonathan Mcintosh. We were speaking about his book, The Flame Imperishable, Tolkien, St. Thomas, and the Metaphysics of Fairy. This is a really great book. I thought that it broke new ground in Tolkien scholarship, at least as far as I could tell. And we kind of talked about Tolkien's metaphysical approach overall, some of the connections with Aquinas you can find there. And then we kind of did, at the end of the episode, a very close reading together of, I think it was about the first page of the Silmarillion, part of the creation account, some of the metaphysical implications of what Tolkien does there. And in the clips you'll hear Jonathan speaking about Tolkien's general desire for metaphysical correctness and consistency in his created world, and then some of the gradations of evil that you see laid out by Tolkien, particularly in the motives of Melkor or Morgoth, who's kind of the Satan figure in the Silmarillion.
So if our subcreations are to be a faithful adornment and furthering of God's own act of creation, then they need to be like it, and part of that likeness is this metaphysical consistency. The one other passage I would point people to, and it's one that I return to over and over again in the book, and that is his letter to Peter Hastings, who is a fellow Catholic. He was, I believe, a manager of the Newman Bookshop in Oxford, correspondent with Tolkien, really was enthusiastic about Tolkien's work, but had, in part as a Catholic, had some concerns about some of the what we might call metaphysical liberties Tolkien seemed to be taking in his fiction. And so he, one of the things he faults, I'm trying to remember if this is one of the critiques he makes, but anyway, he makes raises a number of concerns about Tolkien's fiction.
Wasn't Elvish reincarnation one of the big ones?
That's where I was going to go with that, but I couldn't remember if that
I think
was
it
one
was.
Of them that he read. I think it was, yes. I think you're right. And Tolkien responds by, I'm trying to remember what Peter Hastings says, is something to the effect that we shouldn't subcreate beyond what God himself has made. And Tolkien turns that around and says, well, I should have thought that that's exactly what the subcreator does, is it takes what God has already made and then moves beyond that. But one of the things Tolkien says is, nevertheless, our subcreations need to be a tribute to what God has made. So again, it's that sense that we are exploring the contingencies that God has built into creation, but that's exactly what they are. They're contingencies. God has created us as free beings. That means we need to explore, we need to name, we need to develop. We are God's own agents under his authority and under his sovereignty, but with his blessing for continuing his work. So that's just the tension of where we need to both, in some sense, go beyond what God has done, although when we do that faithfully, it's not something we're doing over against what the Creator has done. It's something that he is doing, in fact, in and through us. We are his unique agents, his unique instruments for accomplishing a different kind of work. So we need to go beyond, but yet still do so in a way that's faithful to, and is, again, the word that he uses, a tribute to what God has already done.
And it's in this letter to Peter Hastings that, as you quote, Tolkien said that his mythology from beginning to end is mainly concerned with the relation of creation to making and subcreation, and therefore references to these things are not casual but fundamental. And in this book, one of the really interesting things that you've done is you've brought out just how thoroughly that theme permeates his work, even, for example, his treatment of evil. To a large extent, he treats evil as a perversion, either a corrupt desire to have God's power of creation out of nothing, or a perversion of the legitimate desire to subcreate. And maybe we can get into that to an extent a bit later. But maybe I was hoping you could make a parallel there, because you did mention Joseph Pieper talking about creation being the great theme in Thomas Aquinas. So in what way is that the case?
For Aquinas or for Tolkien?
For Aquinas.
It's been so long since I've read Pieper. Let's see. Okay, well, I'll try this on. It may not be what you're looking for. You can cut it out if you don't like it. But in terms of his metaphysics, one of the insights of Aquinas that's commonly pointed to by intellectual historians is how Aquinas's distinction between a real distinction, he says, that exists in all creatures between the essence of a thing and its existence. And basically, what Aquinas was doing there was taking a very ancient Aristotelian distinction between act and potency and pushing it in under the guidance of the Christian doctrine of creation, pushing it to a place that Aristotle himself didn't take that distinction. For Aristotle, really, the act-potency distinction is almost synonymous with the form-matter distinction. And so for a thing to have potency, it has to have matter. Well, what the Christian doctrine of creation plus the Christian idea of angels as these intellectual beings that aren't material and yet they are created, what it did is it gave Aquinas this realization that there's an even deeper metaphysical distinction to be made between what a thing is, essence, and its actual active existence. And so some scholars would point to that as one of Aquinas's key insights. And if so, again, I would point to that as evidence of the doctrine of creation really animating much of Aquinas's thought and leading him to new kinds of metaphysical insights that he himself wouldn't have drawn attention to as an insight. Aquinas was a very humble thinker. There was no virtue in novelty for him. And so far as he was able, he would always credit somebody else with ideas, even if in some ways they were original to Aquinas himself.
I guess if there's a Thomistic theme, broadly speaking, it is just this reinforcement of the infinite gap between the prerogatives of God in every way, but specifically here as creator out of nothing and his creatures. Because Melkor it's being really hammered in here. He is looking in the void places for the imperishable flame. And but he didn't find it because it's with Iluvatar. In other words, this fire is something that is essentially attached to, it is essential to God as God. It is not something, maybe this is going a little beyond what Tolkien says here, but it is not, according to Aquinas, it is not something that God can delegate, or at least, and here at least he does not choose to do so.
No, if he can't delegate it, because to delegate it would be to delegate the prerogative of Godhead. God cannot be not God.
Right.
And this is I think a Thomistic moment or a possible one, in that Aquinas himself, although he doesn't commit himself, he raises the possibility that this, and I think he even cites John Damascene, a statement by John Damascene, how the devil fell by desiring the power of creation. I could be misremembering that. It's either the power of creation or just wanting to be God himself. And Aquinas picks up on that as at least a possibility, right? We just don't know. There's been given no direct, clear revelation on that point. And so Tolkien makes it part of his own story. The Melkor falls by seeking to be God, seeking to have his own creative power. And in the final chapter of the book, I suggest that Tolkien gives us something of a hierarchy of evil, where there's several. I distinguish, I think, 5 different distinct kinds of evil in Tolkien's legendarium, but they all have this common theme. The one is this desire for creation. That's where the power of creation. That's where evil begins. And then we have the corrupted desire of subcreation. We see that in I think Aule. And then we have the desire for preservation, which is characteristic of the elves, where we want to preserve things, beautiful things, but in a way that goes beyond their ordained lifespan. That's the elvish temptation. And then we have domination, where we still are okay with other things existing, but we want to control them. We want God's own power over their being. And Sauron represents that. And then finally, the will to annihilate, where just as only the Creator has the power of creation, so only the Creator has the power of annihilation, of taking away being. But and that's interesting. By the end of the Ainulindale, Melkor falls by desiring this power to give being. It's really interesting that by the end of the Ainulindale, a few pages later, he's gone all the way down, corrupted all the way down into just trying to annihilate the being of other things that his fellow Ainur, his fellow Valar have made.
And in both cases, it's an illusion. We've already talked about the illusion of being able to create out of nothing for Melkor, but it's also an illusion that he can make things cease to exist. All he can do is essentially break things down into their constituent parts, or deform or flatten them, but he cannot cause anything to cease to be, in terms of sort of maybe prime matter or whatever you would call it in Thomistic terms. It's just right. What exists does exist by the fact that God holds it in existence. Next, a clip from episode 41, The Neo-Colonial West is Forcing Abortion on Africa. Obianuju Ekeocha is the author of a book called Target Africa, Ideological Neocolonialism in the 21st Century, and a documentary on the same topic called Strings Attached. In this clip, you'll hear us speaking about an organization called Marie Stopes International, which is kind of like a European Planned Parenthood, receives massive amounts of funding from Western governments and NGOs, and pushes abortion into Africa, including setting up abortion clinics in countries in which they're illegal. And we specifically talk about their activities in Kenya here. I believe you focused a lot on Marie Stopes International's activities in Kenya, right, in the documentary?
Yes.
How do they go about running these illegal abortion clinics in Kenya?
So they're all set up everywhere. They're both in Kenya and Uganda and even Nigeria and other places. But the documentary, as you say, I concentrated on Kenya, and I also did some work in Uganda with some of the quote unquote family planning practices that are also quite unethical. However, what they do when they come to a place, they settle in, and they come in and settle in as a family planning organization, reproductive rights organization. They set up clinics, usually in the capital cities of the countries where they exist. But then from those capital cities, they then have what they call their mobile clinics. And that's why I think they can have such a wide reach, because I don't know if you've been to Africa. Africa is much more developed than people think. But then the thing is that there is still a lot of Africa that will go under the classification of rural areas. So there are many places within various countries where it's not very accessible. So if you see what I mean, there are people in villages where for you to get there, you need a 4-wheel drive, for example. It's not all that easy to get to the people. However, Marie Stopes has enough money for them to get everything they need to reach into these villages. They set up their mobile clinics, which only run for a short period of time. They do their dirty business there, and then they leave and go to another part of the country or another village or rural area. Now, the problem with this is that because these are very hard to reach areas, there is absolutely no oversight. They answer to no one. They get there, they do what they want to do, and they walk away. So there are a lot of terrible things that happen that for you to even find out that Marie Stopes has, devastated or destroyed so many people's lives, you too have to be able to get access to get to those villages. And sometimes that is quite a hard task. So this is what they do. They have their major clinics or their major branches within the bigger cities. And then from there, they run mobile clinics throughout the country. There's also something else that they're doing in some countries, which I have found to be the case in Kenya, in Ethiopia. So when they get into a country, there may be some kind of very basic, healthcare centers or small women's clinics and things like that. So those who show interest. I mean, they actually co-opt these smaller clinics and get them to rebrand and become almost like a subsidiary, if that could make sense. So they take over structures, smaller structures of smaller basic healthcare centers and make them principally abortion centers. So in Kenya, they are called the Amua clinics. So a clinic that exists, maybe a private clinic being run by some doctor, if they come to some agreement with Marie Stopes will come in and give them money, give them funding, give them what they need to then be transformed into reproductive rights or reproductive health centers. So these are places maybe where lives could have been saved before, maybe where, real healthcare could have been given. But because these are also clinics that need money, Marie Stopes comes around. They are the only ones that come around. They come with a lot of funding, and they're able to kind of take over these subsidiary clinics, train them up, and make them little abortion centers. In Ethiopia, they're using also a very similar marketing strategy. This is how they're able to multiply themselves and clone themselves in whatever country that they exist.
So to what degree are they attempting to conceal this? And if so, how do they do that?
Well, they are concealing it. They are concealing it because, if, for example, if they're doing abortions in a country where abortion is not legal, they already are in very dangerous, quarters because they are already in illegal practice. So most times when they have their staff, they're part of this, right? Once they get into this, they find out this is an abortion, this is an abortion practice. Is either you leave or you stay and become part of this whole illegal cartel or whatever it is that they do. So what you find is that because of poverty and because of difficulty and unemployment rates, people find it quite difficult to leave Marie Stopes, not because they like it, but because they are stuck in it and they feel that there's no place else that they can go and get another job as a nurse or as an admin staff or whatever. But then they just become part of this whole concealment project. And in the documentary Strings Attached, I did get to speak to one of their staff who managed to escape that lifestyle. And she was herself quite devastated by what had happened to her in Marie Stopes International. So this is it. They are concealing it. They are hiding. A lot of their services they do over the phone. They have toll-free lines and people can reach them in different countries. They also have incredible activity on social media. When you go to their Twitter page for some of the Marie Stopes branches, it's incredible. They are posting things all the time. They are posting veiled messages that you can see. Anyone reading it would know these are abortion advertisements. These are abortion ads. We know it. It's very obvious. But, they have a lot of ways of reaching young people and also word of mouth, of course, young people in universities and all that. One of the women I interviewed in the documentary was someone who knew about Marie Stopes from her university. So it's word of mouth. It's the people who are working there who then become part of the whole illegal project. And then there is, they have all their hidden services, phone, internet, the media, they're using everything possible. And they continue to get on and get off that way. And because in most of these African countries, our law enforcement are very much stretched to the limit. They're very much, under-equipped, underfunded. They tell you they can't go around chasing Marie Stopes. And even when they're reported, it's really very hard to get anything out of it because these people, these law enforcement agencies in African countries, they're already stretched thin. So Marie Stopes just keeps getting away with what they do. And the documentary was really an attempt to expose some of it, not all of it, but quite a bit of what they do and how they operate.
And I remember you had a number of recordings of the calls to that toll-free line in the film. Can you give us a sort of a sense of how those would go?
Yeah. So I had gotten a friend of mine who lives in Kenya, and he also has friends in university. So these are young people, and they had agreed to make calls on, for us to record calls. So we talked about it and they agreed to do it. And then they made the calls. And, there was a call where one of the young girls that we had got, she said she was pregnant, and immediately Marie Stopes staff was offering her abortion pills. They were offering to bring it to her house. They were offering to, to post it. They were offering to send it to her by courier. And what she's saying, my parents are going to be upset. This lady the Maristov staff was really offering it to her like some sort of a marketing, a very fierce marketing strategy. And then there was another one where a guy had also phoned just so that we can cover everything we needed to also have a guy call to show that Maristov doesn't really care much about women. This is a guy who said his girlfriend is pregnant, but that he's not ready. So it was not really about her, it was about him. And still, on top of that, the Maristov staff was offering abortion to him. So there are these various scenarios where you would find that they have absolutely no checkpoints or they just offer abortions and abortion pills, which again is illegal. And again, just for people to bear this in mind, that this is a British organization being highly funded by the British government and other Western governments, doing this on African soil, doing this in African countries where they have laws and rule of law. So it's just the mind-blowing stuff of it, that these organizations are operating as they do, or they're operating as they want, but then they are foreign organizations. So surely there has to be, some kind of bilateral thing that has been breached here, because, it's one thing that Planned Parenthood, for example, is doing all the terrible things they're doing in the United States, but it's another thing that it's a foreign organization coming in and doing that. So it's doubly offensive. It's doubly offensive.
Now, given the lack of oversight, I can't imagine that the conditions in these clinics is too good.
No, it's not. As one can attest to it, even in Western countries where there is very close oversight, the Maristov has still had a lot of problems. In the UK, where in one particular 3-month period in the United Kingdom, they had over 2,000 violations by the Commission for the Care Quality Commission here in the UK. But imagine what then happens in African nations. All the people who have worked for them, who have come out, have the same thing to say. It's the way they operate. In Uganda, when I spoke to a staff this wasn't part of the documentary, but I had spoken to a staff of Maristov who came out, who told me that actually the abortions there in their Ugandan clinics are not being performed by doctors even. So in Uganda, it's being performed by what they call medical assistants or medical officer. For you to be a medical officer, you just have to finish high school. So if they're not even nurses, they're just people trained to go in and remove babies from wombs. So it's all kinds of terrible things and unbelievable things. And even when you go beyond abortion and you say, okay, maybe they're doing family planning, and you look at their family planning practices, it's also very, very problematic. Again, that part was captured in the documentary, where we went to a Ugandan village and we spoke to so many women, and these women had the same thing to say. It's Marisovs came to our village, gave us contraception in their mobile clinic, and then went away and left us. And we had, one of the women said she bled for more than a year every day of her life until she had it removed. Sometimes these women don't have easy access to doctors. So when they have any side effects, they don't know what to do. They don't know where to go. And meanwhile, they have an IUD stuck inside them, because a lot of the methods that Maristos uses in some of these African villages are like the ones that women can't get easily removed, right? They're implants, they are IUDs that they insert into the uterus. So these women cannot just stop it, or it's not a pill. It's not. They are giving them things that the women themselves are stuck with, and the women are sterilized with, in a sense of speaking. So even when we spoke to a doctor in that Ugandan village who runs a small clinic, he said that at one point in time, a woman, he saw this woman, she was dying of, nobody knew what was wrong with her. And then they did an x-ray, and there they found an IUD inside her body that she had carried for about 10 years. IUDs are not meant to stay that long, but this woman it was just there, and it was rotting her womb, he said. So these are some of the horrible, unethical things that would even fall into like human rights abuse, possibly. And Maristos is getting away with it because absolutely nobody is there to defend the women. They cannot be sued. They cannot be caught at what they do. But the good thing is that these women always know who brought contraceptives to them. Even if they can't speak English, everybody knows Maristos. They can say who gave them this, device or this IUD or whatever that has caused them all the problems.
And aren't they using a lot of medications and technologies that are kind of rejected in Western countries?
Absolutely. They absolutely are. There was a time they were giving a lot of implants. What was it? The little one that you insert in the arm. And that particular device had been completely rejected. It had been removed out of the Western market. So much settlement had been made as well, out of court settlement, where women in the West who had used it was the no plant. People rejected no plant. No plant was withdrawn from market. The producers and manufacturers of no plant were giving women money they paid more than something like $50 million in out of court settlement to different women who had problems with it in the West. But at the time, or at that same time, and even years after, they were still out there. Maristas was still out there in villages giving no plant to women. And these women really suffered it. But the difference is that no one came to, give them anything out of court settlement, because that's it. The Africans cannot complain, and the Africans are never heard, or they hardly ever heard. And that's really why I made the documentary, because I wanted the world for the first time to just hear these women's voices.
Okay, finally, I'm going to give you a couple clips from episode 44, Catholics Need Poetry, but Do We Want It? With Dana Gioia. Dana Gioia is one of the greatest Catholic poets working today, certainly the best known in America, one of the most high-profile guests I've had on the podcast. He was the head of the National Endowment for the Arts for several years under George Bush. In this interview, we talked about his essay collection from Wise Blood Books, The Catholic Writer Today, and other essays. And he reads a number of his poems, and we talked about a number of different poetry-related things. First, you'll hear him talking about the importance of Catholic involvement in the arts and poetry, and then you'll hear him reading and discussing a couple of his poems.
Not everyone can understand science. Not everyone can reason particularly well with conceptual language. Very few people are given mystical knowledge, but everyone can react in the fullness of their humanity to a poem, to a story, to a song, to a movie. Catholics lost their connection, as it were, to beauty, to poetic language. And because of that, it's limited our ability to talk to the world. As you know, and the reason you're inviting me to speak today is that I just published a book called The Catholic Writer Today. It begins with an essay called The Catholic Writer Today, not surprisingly, which was published in First Things a few years ago. When that essay was published, it created an explosion of reactions, because even though I was talking about writers, I think many, many Catholics understood that I was talking about how Catholicism had retreated from the world of arts, from the language of arts. And because of that, there was a kind of basic deprivation of not only Catholic experience, but the ability of the church to be heard in the world, to speak effectively to the world. And I think that people will go back and forth on this philosophically, but let me just say something. I know a lot of people who have become Catholics, who are converts. My wife herself is a convert. A few of them converted because of philosophical, theological arguments. Most of them converted because of something that was experiential. They walked into Notre Dame and they experienced something there that all of their logic could not account for. And it's that experience, hearing Mozart, reading Dante, that they began to explore, and the exploration eventually led them into the church. That is what we have lost. Now, that being said, as an artist, I don't believe that the purpose of art is to convert people and bring them into the church. But what I do think is that, and I'll just speak as a poet, what poetry is a kind of human conversation. And if you envelop people in a conversation which considers certain things that perhaps the mass media, the commercial entertainment culture, which just has absorbed everything in the world, not just in the West anymore, but the entire world, conversations that wouldn't be happen in that culture, it's very powerful.
Coming at this as a musician, I do believe that the greatest service that art, and especially music, can do for the church today, specifically, even more than conveying Catholic values in some way, is to get them out of their heads. And I feel that we, at least in the environment I grew up in, have a very over-intellectualized version of the faith. And I think you mentioned mystical knowledge. It's true that mystical knowledge and poetic knowledge are not the same thing, but Maritain would say they both proceed by a similar dynamic, which is...
They're both experiential and holistic.
Yes, and they have to do with oneness, where you become one in a way with the thing that's contemplated. So I think that the greatest thing that the arts can do for the church now is to teach people contemplation in an age that is either really in your head or in your flesh. It's like we're either distracted, our entertainment is distracting us and not centering us, or we are totally in our head and out of the senses and the world of reality.
The entertainment culture in which we live largely speaks to the worst part of our humanity. It speaks to our most craven instincts. It speaks to our resentments, our fears, our envies, and it's very powerful. You can speak to the lowest and you can speak to the highest part of you in music or in poetry. But let me say something about poetry and see if you as a musician don't think that this is almost identical to what goes on in music, because poetry and song are the same art. If you go back into ancient culture, everything that they called a poem was either chanted or sung, or quite often chanted, sung, and danced. And song were ways of making art with your human body. In fact, if you go back to Latin, in Latin, the word for song is carmen, like the woman's name, Carmen. Carmen also means a song. It also means a prophecy. It also means a magic spell. So if you look at this, like, why are they using the same word? Well, it's because the Romans understood the nature of poetry. Poetry is a special way of speaking in which speech becomes elevated to song. It's a special way of speaking that creates a kind of magic spell. Same as music. When people are into music, you'll see their bodies moving in time with the music. Poetry and music both seek to create a kind of mild hypnotic spell. This allows us to kind of focus on the song, focus on the poem, and relax our defenses so that our memories, our intuition, our emotions come closer to the surface. So it's a special way of speaking that invites and rewards a special way of listening. And it allows a kind of transaction to happen. Now, I think in general what entertainment does is just to try to bring you to predestinations, to places that are easily manipulated. But I think real art opens up something and lets you explore it, creates a relationship with the work, which requires you to work a little harder in terms of perception. And so when I see myself as a poet, and I'm happy to say that poetry is now the fastest growing art in the United States. It's not my opinion. It's statistics based on the last NEA National Arts Participation Survey. So there's something happening right now in our culture which is making poetry more rather than less relevant. And I think one of the things is that people are hungry for an experience that isn't dictated by global entertainment corporations, that isn't openly manipulative on their psyches, on their minds. And see, in Catholic iconography, the thing that killed you, you carry proudly. So they chop, your head off with an axe. You have the axe in your hand. If you're St. Bartholomew and they flayed you, you hold the knife which they've flayed you, which is to say, the very thing which your enemies thought would destroy and indeed shame you, you hold proudly, because to a certain degree, it is the instrument of your redemption, of your sanctification. I don't think I'm stretching the metaphor by saying one of the things that makes poetry popular, one of the things that makes poetry trustworthy is its very unpopularity. Nobody can make money off poetry, which means that even if you're listening to a poem, even if it's a bad poem, there is something authentic about it, something that isn't prefabricated about it. Now, I'm not particularly interested in bad poetry, but I think what it also means is that a real poem people are drawn to because it gives them a kind of transaction which other things in their culture do not readily do. I think you could say the same thing for jazz. The experience of listening to jazz is just fundamentally different than listening to, one of the highly overproduced pop songs, that are being sold today. So what I'm trying to do as a poet is, in a sense, to preserve, to expand, to refine a kind of human capability, not really being nourished elsewhere. That's not an argument that's unlike the argument we make for the church. I mean, I think people come into the church because they feel a hunger which is not being fed elsewhere.
One of the videos that you sent me of you reading a poem, reading one of your poems, and one of the poems in this collection is The Road, which is definitely, I don't know if this was intended this way or not, but it's one of the most terrifying poems I've ever read. That's how I read it. I don't know if it's supposed to be read that way, but I read it as terrifying, like, oh, I don't want this to happen to me. And a number of the poems that you recommended that I read prior to this interview, they seem to share sort of a theme of frustrated desire or just a failure to desire at all. And I suppose it would be something more like the latter in this case. There were a few that struck me, and actually one of them wasn't one of the ones you mentioned. The Road and Nothing is Lost spoke to me very personally as well. But I wonder if you could read us The Road first off.
Yeah, let me read this. Let me say two things to introduce it, though. First of all, it's a sonnet. I don't normally write sonnets, but there was an editor, a guy named Bill Baer, actually, very devout Catholic. He used to run a Catholic writers conference at a convent in New Jersey. But Bill Baer kept wanting to, sonnet. And finally, I was writing a poem, and it was sort of hovering between 13 and 14 lines. And so I decided for him to make it a sonnet. So it's a very unusual sonnet. It doesn't have the normal rhyme scheme. It all rhymes, but rhymes differently than the normal one. But secondly, this last weekend, I taught an all-day seminar for a Catholic reading group in Napa on the Divine Comedy. So we spent the day just going through the opening cantos of the Inferno. And so my poem, The Road, uses one of the oldest symbols in poetry, which is the road as a symbol of the journey of life. The road. He sometimes felt that he had missed his life by being far too busy looking for it. Searching the distance, he often turned to find that he had passed some milestone unaware, and someone else was walking next to him. First friends, then lovers, now children and a wife. They were good company, generous, kind, but equally bewildered to be there. He noticed then that no one chose the way. All seemed to drift by some collective will. The path grew easier with each passing day. Since it was worn and mostly sloped downhill, the road ahead seemed hazy in the gloom. Where was it he had meant to go? And with whom?
Yeah. It's so scary.
Well, yeah, I've always resisted the notion of writing an uplifting poem. I mean, my poems are there to make you think about things. And this is a poem about whether you're choosing your own path in life or if you're just following the crowd, taking the most worn way. And so anyway, I like that poem. It's nice to have a poem only 14 lines long that says something important.
It had a very biblical resonance for me. Not that people don't choose their path exactly, but sometimes they sort of choose not to choose, and in so choosing, they choose or something.
Well, Joshua Wren, the fiction writer who is also the publisher of Wise Blood books, called me a Christian existentialist. And I never thought of myself in those terms, but I think it's actually quite true. It's about the whole notion of being responsible for defining your own existence, about making the choices which define you. As Kierkegaard says, the existential leap.
Right.
And this poem is a poem about somebody who doesn't want to leap, just wants to stroll along and is kind of too preoccupied by things. I mean, I think that's actually the existential dilemma of the current generation. Your generation, even more than me, is you're just besieged by emails, by tweets, by phone calls, by social media. You've got 1,000 things to do, to listen to, to watch. And not you, because you're obviously someone who's developed your inner life, but so many people are so busy, they have no time alone. They have no solitude. They have no time to hear themselves think. And I worry about the kind of deprivation of the inner life that happens when you're so distracted by so many things outside of yourself. And the consumer culture is about feeding you with desire and convincing you that if you only have this next new thing, see this next new thing, that your desires will be satisfied. But it's like living off junk food. You eat and eat, you get fatter and fatter, and you aren't nourished.
The Road, which we just heard, is one of 3 poems I'd like to ask you to read, all of which, to me, they sort of have formed a trilogy in my mind, and they all have biblical resonance to me. And one of the other ones, if you wouldn't mind, would be Nothing is Lost, because where The Road provides sort of a warning to me, Nothing is Lost, having read it just this evening, at a time in my life which, the poem perfectly resonates with at age 29, where I'm really been reassessing a lot of things about my past and what that bodes for the future and how to start afresh. It is very sobering, but it offers something of a constructive approach. I wonder if you could read that one.
I'd be happy to. I'm glad you like it. This is part of a sequence of poems that I wrote that are unified. But I want to say this, the central image of this poem is just a coin. It's a coin, it's in your pocket. And if you pick a coin up, it has all these Latin or old words, mottos written on it. And the older it is, the more worn it is. And the notion that it could be a quarter in your pocket that was in your pocket 20 years ago. Nothing is lost. Nothing is lost. Nothing is so small that it does not return. Imagine that as a child, on a day like this, you held a newly minted coin and had the choice of spending it in any way you wished. Today, the coin comes back to you, the date rubbed out, the ancient mottos vague, the portrait covered with the dull shellac of anything used up, passed on, disposed of, with something else in view, and always worth a little less each time. Now it returns, and you will think it unimportant, lose it in your pocket change as one more thing that's not worth counting, not worth singling out. That is the mistake you must avoid today. You sent it on a journey to yourself. Now hold it in your hand. Accept it as the little you have earned today, and realize that you must choose again, but over less.
That is an interesting last line. I mean, it could mean less in the sense of you have less to sort of invest or a lesser return, so you had better choose what you can get wisely. But it could imply that there's sort of a limited amount of resources that you've been dealt.
All of your interpretations are right. When a poem creates a story, creates a situation, creates an image which resonates different meanings. If it was just one meaning, you'd write it as prose. What I'm trying to do is give you that experience, give you that choice, give you whatever coin it is that's come back to you that you have to choose how to use, and have your life interpret the poem.
Right. Well, I mean, the poem is very sober, but it offers hope in the form of reality.
Well, it is. I mean, it is. I mean, reality is what it is. And if you try to pretend that reality is something simpler and happier and brighter, it's not commensurate with our lives. Our lives are full of joys. They're full of losses. They're full of challenges. They're full of rewards. And you have to sort of see it all together. And so I think it's important to mix the dark and the light. That's reality. Every day we have night and day.
So, guys, thanks for listening to this. We have 3 other podcasts on the Catholic Culture Podcast Network. Let me review them for those of you who aren't aware. We have Way of the Fathers with Mike Aquilina. That will continue on its bi-monthly schedule very consistently. Got some great material for you coming up. Check that out. You can check all of these out on CatholicCulture.org or in your podcast app of choice. Catholic Culture audiobooks will also be continuing a normal schedule. That is a very spiritually enriching podcast, as you might imagine, with all these works from the saints and the fathers of the church read by our very capable voice actor, James Majewski. Finally, there will also be continuing episodes of Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. So again, check out all those at CatholicCulture.org, and God bless you. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you soon.